Hello and welcome back to the channel. Welcome back, Rich, to the channel. First time in
Thank you.
a long time. You may have,
Yeah, glad to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
yeah, you may recognize Rich if you're a long time viewer from our best albums of 1970 video a long time ago. But we finally decided to get together, and this is what this series is all about. Anatomy of a Classic is bringing friends on to talk about classic albums that maybe specialize is the right word, but specialize in or are familiar with. um,
Right.
and I've sort of mentioned it briefly on the channel. You can see American Stars and Bars up there. Um, I've become a Neil Young super fan over the past 6 months. It's kind of sprung out of nowhere on me, and this album was kind of
Wow.
what kicked it all off. So yeah, I knew I had to do Neil Young, and I knew Rich would be game for talking about After the Gold Rush. So yeah, I guess I'll pass it over to you first. Like, what is your history with the album? How did you discover it? All that fun stuff.
But I knew some of Neil Young's early work. 1970, I'm 13 years old, so I'm listening to a lot of pop AM radio. I really didn't get into the FM stuff until a little bit later in the 70s, but I had this album called Decade, which is like a two album Neil Young best of. All of his early work is in it, and I start digging through these songs, and I'm going, wow, other than Harvest, I don't really have any of his albums, so I have to go back and get them. And then I got this album, and everybody knows this is nowhere. And I was hooked like you were at that time in my team. And what can I say? I mean, the man, prolific, interesting. He's always changing it up. I tend to gravitate towards the country or the folkier stuff more than the hard rock. That's just my nature. But I appreciate all he can do, the wide range of talent that he has. The songwriting in particular is top notch, always has been. A sense of melody, the voice. Once you get past that high, I would call it almost an acquired taste voice. It's not for everyone. You realize that the emotion and the heartfelt feelings are in there, and he's writing his own songs, and you just into it. I mean, what can I say? I knew of Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young from Deja Vu, and a couple of his tunes were on there, like Helpless. And what was the other one? There was another tune on there. He
Yeah,
had a couple of songs
yeah. I
on
can't think
there.
off the top of my head what his other song was.
Yeah, but he had two of the on that album, and I've been a fan for a long time. This is one of his top, arguably his top album, but maybe two or three albums for sure. And glad to be here to discuss it with you.
Yeah, kind of going to echo a lot of what you said. I had a very good friend when I was about 16, 17, who kind of guided me towards classic rock. And I feel like when you're at that age, some of the stuff you're going to gravitate towards, some of the stuff you're going to sort of push against and be like, oh, it's not as good because you want to have your own sort of opinion, right? That's just how teenagers are. And
Exactly.
he introduced me to Led Zeppelin, who I loved immediately, the Beatles, who I loved immediately, and Neil Young. She was like, listen to After the Gold Rush. And I listened to the first two songs and I hated it. I had to turn it
Really?
because I couldn't stand his voice. His voice was so sort of high pitched and
Yeah.
nasal, and I just thought, no, this is not for me. And then a couple of years ago, when I was really getting into music, when the COVID pandemic started, really, I came back to After the Gold Rush, and I thought, well, it can't be that bad because I'd come to like Harvest. I liked Everybody Knows This Is Nowhere. So I figured there's got to be something for me here if I can just get past his voice. Because I think you speak about his voice being an acquired taste. I think, especially on this album, he is really
Yes.
straining his voice a lot of the time. And like you said, once you come to love Neil's music, this album is more special because it feels more emotional and more sort of, yeah, that the voice makes it unique within his catalog. And once I gave it
Right.
a full spin and really got into its atmosphere, I loved it. And every listen, I feel like I love it even more. I was spinning my vinyl copy called
As
Gatefold.
was I.
Yeah. And I was just amazed by, like, we'll get to the track ratings later, but some songs that I not discounted, but I was like, oh, they're weaker album tracks, but they're still really,
Yeah,
really great. And I've come to like American Stars and Bars up there. I think is one of his most underrated albums. Rust Never Sleeps, I love. Everybody knows This Is
yeah,
Nowhere, On the Beach. All these albums, Zuma, they're amazing. But this is the top dog for me. This is the one
yeah,
that remains at the top. It has everything that I want from Neil. It has the one or two rocking tracks, but
yeah.
mainly the more stripped back singer songwriter stuff. So
Exactly. That's exactly where I'm at with it. And as I was listening to it, I agree with your point that some of the songs that are sort of throwaways when you look back, that when you hear them again, they reinforce the greatness of the album. I mean, it is consistently good all the way through,
mm,
in my opinion. I don't think there's a bad track. Even the cover track is not bad. It's just maybe not as good as some of the Neil written tracks.
yeah, and then that leads us to sort of the background of the album, which I'll just go on a bit of a spiel
Yeah.
about. Not as much with some other albums. I think what I found interesting about this album initially was sort of the structure of the two sides of the album, right? Where they both have these songs and then they both end with a very short tune that's almost like a sing along,
Mhm.
which is a really strange thing on such a somber, melancholic album that they
Yeah.
both sides end with this sort of like chirpy sing along, like 1 minute song. Which I think works really well at just 34 minutes. It's so easy to pick up and play whenever. I noticed on the back of the sleeve says most of these songs are inspired by the Dean Stockwell Herb Berman screenplay After the Gold Rush. Actor Dean Stockwell, good friend of Neil's. Again, to bring up American Stars and Bars, he designed that album cover, and they sort of were close friends for a while. And it's kind of interesting that this sort of screenplay that never got off the ground was the inspiration for this album that's become legendary, which is, I think is really interesting. You have the core Crazy Horse members here, Danny Whitten, Nils Lofgren, Billy Talbot, and Ralph Molina. And of course, you have Stephen Stills providing backing vocals, which gives it that sort of CSNY sound on a couple tracks, which you don't really get in much of Neil's other discography, the rest of his discography, maybe on Harvest as well.
Yeah.
He sort of has his own vibe, this sort of loose, sort of reflective, dreamy vibe. And you do get that on here, but the harmonies from Stephen Stills are a big part of this album, and we're going to talk about the lead single next. Only Love Can Break Your Heart, and this is a great example of it. I mean, yeah, we sort of talk about picking a lead single and how good a job they did. I think I can see why this was a single. As soon as you've heard it, you know exactly how it goes. It's memorable immediately.
Yeah. And it was supposedly written for Graham Nash when he was breaking up with Joni Mitchell. That was the impetus for the song at that time. And it's a simple but very effective song. That strumming to, I mean, it just leads in. I mean, beautifully written and delivered. Uh, it wasn't that big of a single here. I think it was number 33 in the U.S. charts, which is not amazing, but I remember hearing it on the radio in those days, and yeah, I couldn't get enough of it. I mean, they wouldn't play it every hour like some of the hits, but when it came on, I was hooked. You know,
Yeah, it is one of the songs that I think the songwriting feels akin to his '60s writing, like not just obviously CSNY, also Buffalo Springfield.
yes, yeah,
That sort of more '60s sound. I love the lyrics on this one, very cryptic. I have a friend I've never seen. He hides his head inside a dream. Just really, really sort of catches your ear, and you're like, wow, that's unique lyricism. And
yeah,
I think one thing I want to talk about with this song is the band. They're in great form throughout the album. This sort of nice, loose, relaxed feel, which really complements the songs, but it never feels sloppy. It still feels pretty tight as well throughout,
yeah,
which I really appreciate. And yeah, you said it. I've got it in my notes here. One of the most simple choruses you could ever think of, but that's what makes it work. I think his best songs are the most simple ones, where he's just sort of loosely strumming a guitar and sort of singing to his best ability about whatever it may be. But there's a trend that a lot of my favorite Neil songs are very to the point and very simple. And yeah, I think he did that really well.
less is more, as they say, and that definitely is the here.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Um, and then there's the opening track, of course, "Tell Me Why," which Tom in 2016 hated, but now I can't. I think it's one of the best songs on the album. It's so gentle and tender. I think my favorite line on the album is on this song: "I am lonely, but you can free me, all in the way that you smile." Again, just very, very simple, but so moving, so touching, and that's kind of sums up that song for me. It's sort of just a beautiful intro
Yeah,
to.
there's a couple of cool lines in here too. I like this. Is it hard to make arrangements with yourself when you're old enough to repay but young enough to sell? Interesting play on words. And the searcher must ride the horse racing alone in his fright. Tell me why. Tell me why. I mean, it's got all the Neil little nuances in it in the lyricism. Uh,
There's a real sense of yearning to the whole album, but that song especially. Um, yeah,
and it's a good leadoff track too because uh, a lot of albums at that time, the track would be the leadoff track, but this introduced you. It's sort of a Buffalo Springfield esque song, country-ish in a way, and then the title track comes right after it, which is just pulls you in immediately. I mean, that's a classic right there. And that first side of the album is probably tens across the board, pretty much. I
yeah.
didn't
I mean,
want to give away our scores, but it's pretty damn close.
yeah. I was just thinking about this when I was re-listening to it. I was like, is there a side of an album better? There might be as good as, but it's that side one is just it's insanely good.
Yeah, and the
I'm gonna,
singer songwriter era too. For
yeah,
that genre, it's hard to top it. I can't think of one off the top of my head right now that beats it
no, no,
or even equals it. I mean, what else equals it?
yeah. I mean, like off the top, maybe, yeah. I don't know. I can't even think. Like,
I mean, I don't know how you feel about it, but I know Carole King's Tapestry side one's very strong too.
yeah, Moon Dance side one.
Oh
Final.
yeah, well there that might be the one.
Yeah, yeah,
That might be the one.
yeah, yeah.
That's
Um,
another 10 beller.
yeah. I'm going to pass it over to you actually for favorite deep cut. I'm going to let you go first on this because I'm intrigued what you've got for me. Um,
This is hard because it only had the one real hit, only break your heart. But some of the other ones I can't consider deep cuts because they're so well known, like the track and Southern Man. They're not deep cut. I If I had to pick one, I might go with "Don't Let It Bring You Down." Would you consider that a deep cut?
that's also my pick. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the one I would go with
Mm.
if I had to be honest about it. It's just a song about life and some of the suffering and misery that goes along with it, and the imagery in there. Neil's voice again, and it's only castles burning. That imagery is just so unique and so Neil Youngish. I mean, somebody else writes that lyric, it might not work, but with his voice and the melody and everything that goes with it, fantastic.
Yeah,
You know,
that's another thing about Neil that I really have come to appreciate is his melody writing. Like it's
yeah,
appreciated, I think. Like you listen to one of his albums and you get the song stuck in your head. It's he had a real
yeah,
hook for it, more so than people like as much as I love Bob Dylan, more so than Bob Dylan at times, where he wasn't as
yeah.
concerned about having a strong melody. He was just sort of telling you a story. And Neil kind of does both, which I love.
I
Um,
like the way he writes. Again, it's pretty simple, not fancy words, but imagery like cold wind ripping down the alley at dawn, and the morning paper flies, dead man lying on the side of with his the daylight in his eyes. I mean, just really interesting vision. And, putting the words on the paper and then be able to sing them and get across to the listener. It's just excellent.
yeah. So yeah, don't let it bring you down. Also, my deep cut pick. You've said a lot of what I wanted to say. I was going to point
So,
towards the "It's Only
yeah,
Castles Burning" line, which is just yeah, just top notch. Like you said, it's that marriage of the melody and the lyrics that make it work.
and the
Because
voice, and the
and yeah,
voice.
and the voice, of course, yeah.
Yeah,
Like I said, it's vulnerable. The entire album,
yeah,
he's sort of laying his heart out on his sleeve. Um, he's not, like you said, he's not trying to be fancy. He's not trying to put the world to rights. He's just sort of explaining his situation and, you know, a lot of the times, one thing I realized is that songs like Only Love Can Break Your Heart and Don't Let It Bring You Down, they're addressed to someone and maybe about somebody else's feelings.
Yeah.
So it's sort of like what he's observing in other people, but emotionally more than anything else. It's sort of very empathetic in that sense, which I think works really well for, creating this warm, inviting feel that he's sort of just strumming along and telling you about his life and other people's lives. And yeah, it's just, I don't know, it just works for me. So yeah, I considered After the Gold Rush as my deep cut, but I agree with you. It would have been quite cheeky to just consider that a deep cut. But I'll
It
talk
may
about it.
very well be the best song on the album, so I couldn't consider it a deep cut for
Yeah,
me.
exactly. Yeah.
And the one thing that differentiates Neil from, let's say, Bob Dylan, Dylan's got all this cryptic lyricism where you don't really know what he means. You have to, there's a lot of literate figures and historic figures in it. He mixes in and plays against each other. Where Neil Young's pretty straightforward, but he'll throw you a curveball like the castle's burning. I mean, once in a while, and you got to dig into that and what's he saying exactly. So
Yeah,
I don't know.
for sure. Yeah, yeah. And then that leaves us with the closing track, Cripple Creek Ferry, which is an odd one. Sometimes with these videos, we just, it'll be out by now. We just talked about Kate Bush's album Hands of Love. It hasn't been released as we're recording, but will out by now. And that ends on a very short song that is almost like an outro, if anything, which is kind of how I feel about Cripple Creek Ferry, is that it's like a minute and 20 seconds long or
Yeah,
something. Like I said, it's this sort of sing along vibe, so upbeat especially compared to the rest of the album. It's quite sort of bleak in there for a moment. Um, and I think what really impresses me about this and Till the Morning Comes is that any short songs on an album, I mean, you had your series ranking the songs on classic albums, right? You see a short song, you're immediately putting it under the microscope, like this has got to go at the bottom, like it's
right.
short, it doesn't need to be there, it's not fleshed out. It's not the case with these two. They're not easy cuts. I think they're very important to the structure of the album, and like I said, very catchy and memorable and almost fun. So yeah, just a very warm song to close the album on, especially after I Believe in You, which is pretty much what I consider the most emotional song on the album. But yeah, um,
Yeah, Creek Ferry, by the way, it's got that atmosphere, almost a throwback. Where you're riding down the river there with the trees hanging and the steamboat and this and that. It's an exploration from this from a different angle, maybe meandering kind of down the waterway with the bridges and it's weird because I actually there is a place in Colorado called Cripple Creek, and I have been there. It's an old mining up in the mountains, way up, way you almost get nosebleeds from being so high up in the mountains. And I was there on a trip back like 30 years ago, and it takes me. This song takes me back to that, so it does its job, uh, personally. Like
no,
I can picture being there. I wasn't on the river, so to speak, but I know of the landscape and that type of thing with what he's talking about.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
no, that's cool to hear personal stories with some of these songs. Yeah,
yeah.
um, and then yeah, we. How do you even talk about the impact on music history of an album like this? Right? It had a mixed initial reaction, but obviously by now it's lauded as one of the great singer-songwriter albums of the 1970s. Up there with like you said, Tapestry, Blue by Joni Mitchell, Moondance, Van Morrison, all these albums. Um, but you know, I, this is also a trend in this series that I've been finding. I've been looking for the Rolling Stone initial reviews of these albums and whether they went back on their initial reviews. And a lot of the time they do, because Rolling Stone's initial review stated that none of the songs here rise above the uniformly dull surface. That's what Rolling Stone said in 1970. And get this, it only took them 5 years to publish a second review calling it a masterpiece. Like it was just
Well,
like
that was kind of him. Yeah.
yeah, it took them no time at all. By like 75, Neil Young's stock had risen in terms of critical acclaim, and they were like, "Oh wow, okay, we need to go back and change that." Speaking of Rolling Stone, it ranked 90th on their 2020 edition of the all-time great albums. Highly influential album to singer-songwriter and folk rock, as most of Neil Young's 70s work is. You know, you look at his 70s output, it's absurdly good, to be honest. You look at,
It is.
yeah, the early stuff is obviously great. This and Harvest and On the Beach. But then there's like little gems like Comes a Time, I think is really good.
It is.
Zuma obviously is fantastic. American Stars and Bars, Rust Never Sleeps. You know, he even had the time to release another live album, Live Rust, at the end of the decade as well. So, and you were mentioning the decade compilation. You just look at that track list and you think, like, it's his output at this time. It did definitely slow down in the 80s, but in the 70s he was absolutely unstoppable. So yeah, do you have any
I'm,
thoughts
gl-
to that?
I'm glad you mentioned Comes the Time. I think it's an underrated album. I really like that album of his. Uh, People don't talk about it as much as they should. So I just want to say that he was very busy, as we know. I was just writing down some date lines here. August of '69, he wrote the first two songs from this album, I Believe in You and Oh Lonesome Me, which was a cover. Brings in Crazy Horse to do some of the instrumentals. Then he's gone to Woodstock and performing with CSNY for the second time, maybe. Uh, Deja Vu is also being recorded at this time. He's touring with the band at that time. Then comes the spring of '70. The bulk album is recorded then in the studio in Neil's basement. In May of 1970, he writes the song Ohio after state killings, almost on the spur of the moment. Uh, and then he records the last song, Birds, in June of '70. This album comes out in September of that year. The live album is recorded as well, Four-Way Street with Crosby, Stills, Young. So he's constantly working. I mean, he must have been eating, sleeping, and drinking music or seven at this time to come out with all of this material. And it's all, at the highest level. This album predates Tapestry. It predates the two Cat Stevens gems, T for the Tillerman and Teaser for the Firecat. Mitchell's Blue comes out in '71. Paul Simon and Jackson Browne have not even put out their first solo album at this time. So the whole singer-songwriter movement is like a snowball effect. Jim Croce's jumping in, and Dan Fogelberg, and later Joel and Springsteen, and Tom Petty, Warren Zevon. The list goes on. Bob Dylan, of course, preceded him, and people more folky like Joni Mitchell and Leonard Cohen were a few years earlier. But this guy really was laying the groundwork for what was to come, I think, and really strong stuff. I can't say enough good things about it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a fan of Buffalo Springfield, but you listen to those albums and the Neil Young written tracks already at that point, I think, are the best tracks, especially on Buffalo Springfield again.
Yeah.
But yeah, that leaves us then with track ratings. We're going to go by side. I'll go first, do side one, and then you can do side one, and then we'll do side two each. So, side one, Tell Me Why, easy 10. It's not a surprise. After the Gold Rush, also a 10 for me. I guess I'll talk about this one a bit because we haven't yet. Um, I think the way it follows the opener is brilliant. And again, he's sort of almost reaching beyond his comfortable range, like he does on a few tracks, that sort of straining voice. And it's so rare that he just does a piano ballad like this. And when he does, it really is a treasure. And the French horn solo, of course, is
Yeah.
iconic as well. So yeah, easy 10 for After the Gold Rush. I'm with you. My favorite might be that one. It might be Tell Me Why. It's one of those two, I think, for me. Only Love Can Break Your Heart, 10. Um, Southern Man, also a 10. It's a pattern here. The Southern Man is the closest to his sort of extended jams. Like he'd do Like a Hurricane and Cortez the Killer, of course, some of his more famous ones. But this one reins it in a little bit, still under 6 minutes. And it's still, I feel like if he had chucked like an 8, 9, 10 minute on this album at this point, it probably would have ruined the flow a little bit. So the fact that
Yeah.
5.5 minutes, it's enough of a jam that you can get into it, but it doesn't overstay its welcome. And then obviously you get the short and sweet Till the Morning Comes, which I can't give that a 10 as well. I'm giving it a 9. But for what it is a beautiful little song, and yeah, it's one of his most catchy. You know, a lot of the time I am just having it's stuck in my head. You know, that sort of
Yeah.
plonky piano, and yeah, it's great. So that's my side one scores. What
Wow,
about
we're pretty close. I mean, I gave Tell Me Why a nine just because I didn't want to give everybody a 10. But
you?
it is a great country-esque opener. The next three are all tens. Gold Rush is an absolute 10. There's apocalyptic, the past, present, future, the knights in armor and the burned out basement, and then the spaceship coming. All these great images that we get here. I just like that the spaceship flying in the yellow haze of the sun. I mean, just awesome, surreal in a way. Uh, only love can break your heart. 10, definitely. And Southern Man is an absolute 10. The racism, the American South. It's the heaviest song on the album too. It's got that bluesy psychedelic guitar playing throughout with the piano. Do 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 do, and then he's just jamming on that song, and it's fantastic. Till the morning comes, I'm going to give it a nine. So it's got bookend nines on side one with the tens in the middle for me.
Yeah, love that point. I want to say while we're talking about this is the first time I've really been able to sink my teeth into Neil Young on the channel, which is great since I've really got into him. His lead guitar tone I love. It's sort of
Yes.
quite almost sloppy the way he plays, but he's got so much feeling and so much passion that you get through his guitar playing, which is a rare thing, and I think he is one of the masters of it. And I
Yep.
also think After the Gold Rush might be the beginning of his sort of environmentalist
I think
theme,
so.
which he would maybe go over and over and over and over again on later on. But at this point, you know, it was a really good message. Yeah.
Yeah.
So. Side two um, kicks off with "Oh Lonesome Me," which I think many people would put as the weakest song on the album. Not for me. I actually think it's a really nice cover. I give it a nine. I think the melody works for me, and Neil brings his own spin to the song. Um, we talked about "Don't Let It Bring You Down," which is obviously a 10 for me because it's my favorite deep cut. It's a classic Neil Young song, and it's probably the best song on side two, I think. Um,
Yeah.
the next one was the one I struggle with rating the most, "Birds," mainly because to me it is quite forgettable. But it works really well in the album context and it is really pretty. And whenever I hear it, I really enjoy it. So I'm going to give it a nine, just about to the skin of its teeth. um, is that's my least favorite on the album, but I still think it's really nice and works. Like I said, works well between "Don't Let It Bring You Down" and the more upbeat "When You Dance." I can really love, which I think was the second single, if I'm not
Yeah.
mistaken. A really rocking upbeat track. This and Southern Man are really the more rocking songs on the album.
Mm-hmm.
Always loved it, and again, sequencing perfect. Nice jolt of energy just before uh, "I Believe in You." So a 10 for "When You Dance." I can really love, and "I Believe in You" is such a touching song. It's pretty much the emotional climax of the album, so that's a nine for me as well. And then yeah, the close of Cripple Creek Ferry also a nine. So that gets the same score as "Till the Morning Comes" because I think they work very similarly at the end of each side. So yeah, that's
Yeah.
my scores for side two.
Uh, we're close along the way. Maybe one or two differences. I have "Oh Lonesome Me." The cover song is an 8 because I do think it's the least effective song on the album. It's not bad, certainly, but I like the self-written stuff better. Don't let it bring you down is an absolute 10, as we talked about for the deep cut. That was the one that I played repeatedly this week a lot just to let it sink in. I agree with everything you said about birds, about it's kind of edible, but then when you hear it, it brings it right back. Like if I tried to sing the song now, I don't think I do it, but every time it comes on, it's a pretty good song, man. It's beautiful, it's touching, it's hopeful. Interpretation about whether it's a breakup or the end of life. The harmony and the vocals is good. It's a great song. I give it a nine. When You Dance as an 8 for me. I do like upbeat nature, catchy. It comes at the right place in the album, like you mentioned. It's good placement. I Believe in You is a solid 9, classic love song, heartfelt, timeless music. And Cripple Creek Ferry is also a 9, even though it's short and sweet. It's very atmospheric, like we talked about. And I think it ends the album on a really cool note, the way, the going to Cripple Creek Ferry, that whole sing along kind of thing works perfectly. So that's a 9 too. It could be a 10, but this time around it's a 9. So I have four tens out of my 11 songs, I believe, something like that.
Yeah,
So,
I have 6, so it's not bad
wow,
for either of
that's
us.
very good.
And then, yeah, overall personal thoughts. Probably not surprised to hear I give this a 10 out of 10. It has slowly become probably one of my top 20 albums of all time. Um, One of the most pleasant, poetic, and comforting albums that I think exists. Whenever you feel like maybe in a bit of a bad mood, 30 minutes, just chuck it on. Especially when you know the album well on your third and fourth listen. That's when it really gets to you, when you know these songs well. And I think, yeah, it only gets better for me as I've come to know Neil's work more because as I've gone through this deep dive listening to all his 70s and 80s albums and the early 90s sort of revival stuff, um, as I've come to know him, this album remains what my starting point was. And it just is enhanced because of my relationship with the artist becoming deeper.
Yes.
Um, and yeah, it rises above his other work because of the impeccable songwriting and the album's sound. Like it sounds so good, just sort of heavenly. Is that what I would put? So yeah, after the Gold Rush, one of my favorite albums of all time. Very glad we could cover it. Probably my favorite album that I've covered on this series so far. So
Wow, strong praise. You like it a tad more than I do. I love it too, but I would give it a 9. It may get to the 10 range, years go by, but 4 out of the 11 songs are a 10. I can't give it a 10, but it's really close. If I were splitting hairs, it would be a 9.5. For the sake of this rating system, I'm going to go with a 9. It is poetic. It is melodic. The songwriting is a 10. So it's just a few of the songs. Just if they would have taken out that cover song and and he put "Helpless" on this album, it might be a 10. If he had done that without Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young and just stuck it on here, and definitely if they had Ohio and "Helpless" on here, look out.
yeah,
But he was spread out too much at that time, and just a great album. I'm so glad you asked me to do this because this is worth investing time in and repeated listening. I'm glad I had the chance to go through it again a couple times this week.
yeah, it is more than most albums. It rewards repeat listens. And if you find yourself like me that you tried the album and you hated his voice, give it some time and go back to it because look at me now. It's
Yeah,
a drastic difference from my first listen. So thank you, Rich, for joining me. Rich has his own channel, which I will link in the description. You should go check his videos out. Do you want to talk about what you got going on at the moment? Off the top of my head, I remember a few of them. You got a series, the CD Exchange, right?
yeah, we do a CD exchange on Fridays with other members of the VC. Uh, we we were giving out 4 different albums and reading them and coming back one at a time. We're doing one album or one CD, I should say, and getting 4 or 5 opinions on it at once. And it's worked out well. Our viewership has gone up since we went to that method. So that's one thing we're doing. I also have this authentic Hall of Fame thing that we're doing on my channel where we have 6 panelists, all VC members. We nominate in chronological order from the beginning of the Hall of Fame. We're about 12 years in now where we nominate 25 artists each year, a virtual year, and we pick 7 to enter the Hall of Fame. So we started out in the year 1986, I believe, and now we're up to 1998. And artist has to be 25 years of recording to be eligible. So the artists that have started in 1983 are now joining the fray. People like Springsteen and Aerosmith and Queen are now eligible. So we vote on them this week, and we'll see if any of them next time out. But it's a fun project with Glenn Kellaway and Sam St. John, people that you know, and Larry Gray, not Larry Graves, I'm sorry, Brian, Doc, and Randy Nelson. Those are the members of the panel. So
Yeah, so plenty to go over to Rich's channel and enjoy. I actually appeared on a couple of videos with Rich, which I'll link as well, ranking the songs of Bridge Over Troubled Water and Rumours. Rumours was the other one.
yep,
And
we'll have you back. We're on hiatus for classic album song right now while the Hall of Fame's going on, but we're going to get back into that, Sam and I, and we'll work our way around the BC and get you back in.
sweet,
So
looking forward to it. Thank you very much for joining me, Rich. Thank you,
thank
everybody,
you,
for
Tom.
watching, and hopefully we'll catch you soon.